DC Comics is easily one of my favorite superhero brands of all time, and while they have a whole bunch of strengths, one of their biggest weaknesses is trying to do live action. We'll talk about that more in just a second here. With the exception of early Superman and Batman, DC has struggled to adapt most of their heroes to live action. I'm not entirely sure why this is. It doesn't seem like it would be terribly difficult, but for one reason or another, they've just failed to draw a significant audience with their live action projects. The Arrowverse was a shot in the arm that they needed for sure, but that devolved into nonsense fairly quickly. Their best projects they have in terms of on-screen entertainment have always been their animated series and animated movies, and I think the reason this is because they're a lot closer to the comic book than they are with the live-action movies. The live-action movies might try to mimic something from the comic books, but that's not the focus of live-action writers, directors, and producers. The focus of the animated people tends to be, how can we adapt or pay tribute to the comic well enough and make this feel like a motion comic of sorts. I think that's where the strength lies with DC, for sure. Their direct-to-video animated films are some of the best I've ever seen. Stuff like Justice League Doom, Green Lantern First Flight, the Flashpoint movie, and so on and so forth. They not only adapt the comic books fairly well, although there are some inaccuracies, they do a really good job of showcasing these heroes in a way that if you don't read the comics, then you won't feel totally lost, but you'll also be incredibly compelled by these characters. I think that's DC's biggest strength, and they're really not leaning into it as much. They're still trying. They brought on James Gunn because he was so successful with Guardians of the Galaxy, and they think he can helm an entire library of DC films. That's another mistake. Having one person helm your entire universe is absolutely a mistake. It's one thing if you're like, we want to give you a series of Batman or Superman films. It's another thing entirely to say, we want you to build a universe for us from the ground up. I have no faith in James Gunn. And I know a lot of people get upset. They're like, oh, well, all you people complaining, thinking James Gunn's going to fail. It's because you need to have a deep appreciation and understanding for the DC Comics brand in order to adapt these heroes in the way they deserve to. Zack Snyder presented himself as somebody who loved Superman and understood Superman and was trying to reference the comics many ways. Like, he gave Lex Luthor hair. That was something he had in the comics at a certain point. Little things like that. And they did that awesome Superman, I think, what anniversary was it? The 50th? The 70th? They did that awesome animation that talked about the best moments in the comics. And I really did like that, but Man of Steel and Batman v Superman and the Justice League were just, they weren't that great. Even the Snyder cut, it's like, really? The dude just wasn't able to pull it off, and a lot of people just don't want to admit that. Maybe they feel differently, but they weren't seeing the level of success and intrigue that Marvel was. And DC fans have been hoping for that with the live-action projects for many years, but they've always managed, for one reason or another, to fall short. Their strength lies in their animation, because Marvel has done animations that are good too, but their strength is in the live action. They're able to draw people who have no interest in Marvel characters otherwise and bring them into the fold and get them interested. They brought in the normies, for lack of a better term. But DC just doesn't have the power to do this outside of Batman and Superman. The Flash was an absolute terrible failure. Just was. A lot of people had high expectations because of how good the early Flash series on CW was, even though I would argue it really wasn't that great to begin with when you look at it retrospectively. But a lot of people really liked his powers, they liked his suit, they liked the idea of the character, and they're like, hey, this would be great for a movie. But the problem with Flash is that they can't get Barry Allen right. I don't understand this. Barry Allen is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed police detective who's very fiercely independent. He doesn't need a team. He's very good at what he does. But yet, on the CW show, he's constantly got his own mini Justice League running around him, which makes no sense in contrast to the comics and other media. They just completely reinvented the characters. They race and gender swapped some of the characters. They messed with a classic icon because they figure, well, not enough people know about him outside of maybe the Justice League animated series in the 90s show. So we can do whatever we want. And that's a critical mistake. It's an absolute critical mistake. You want to take these characters and leave them intact. The reason the early Marvel movies I consider to be better than anything post-Endgame is because they felt true to the comics. Iron Man, not only did Robert Downey Jr. portray Tony Stark well, but he also portrayed Iron Man well. The entire character, he felt like he was straight out of the page. He looked the part, he sounded the part, based on some of the other media that we had seen before. It just worked. And that's a badge of honor that he can carry with him throughout his career, is that he was the definitive Tony Stark. And that's really cool, because a lot of people didn't know much about Iron Man. They'd seen his cameos in some of the animated stuff and maybe read some of the comics, but most mainstream people just didn't know or care who Iron Man was till that movie. But then they fell in love with him. He became their favorite. You know, the movies did a great job at introducing a lot of people to the greater Marvel universe, and DC has not had the same level of success. They've tried and tried, but they either come across as trying to blatantly copy Marvel where it doesn't work, or they come across as just straight up desperate in terms of their writing and characterization to do something that doesn't fit with the ethos of what's already going on with DC. So I maintain what they need to do is stick to the animated stuff. It'll be better for their budget. It'll be better for the brand. Stick to that and stick to promoting the comics if they ever have good ones. And unfortunately, they don't have a lot of good ones. I was talking to my friend yesterday, and we were both kind of saying, yeah, they're done. Both DC and Marvel are done as far as the comics are concerned. Most of their sales are going to come from reprints of older comics that people couldn't get their hands on. I think that's what they're going to start to pivot to, because a lot of the stuff that's coming out, people don't care about. Nobody wants to see Pregnant Joker. Nobody wants to see Batman in high school. Nobody wants to see Superman's gay son fighting with Antifa. Nobody wants that. That's not who these characters are. That's never been who they are. But they've been given the ability to do that. These writers and artists have been given the ability to mess with these characters, these legacy characters. And it doesn't help them. I'm going to go ahead and say right now, most normies don't read comic books. They don't have the time, they don't have the desire. Even when you present it to them digitally, they just don't do it. Because a lot of them just don't read in general. Some of them will read books. Many of them grew up reading things like Harry Potter and earlier stuff than that. But comic books have always been stigmatized as something for the nerdiest of nerds. But that's where these heroes came from, and that's where these heroes shine, both in comic books and in animation. So I think that DC needs to strengthen that, and they need to provoke Marvel to do the same. Absolutely. Both brands are struggling in their own ways right now. DC was struggling before Marvel, but now Marvel's starting to go downhill because of all of the incessant wokeness, especially with stuff like Secret Invasion. They're not focusing on the core strengths of these characters. They might get a little boost from the next Deadpool, and potentially whenever they release the sequel to Across the Spider-Verse, and the Spider-Man 2 game. But ultimately, they're trending downward, and it's not superhero fatigue. People like seeing these heroes represented in the ways that they grew up with them, but they refuse to represent those heroes that way. And DC is no exception to that rule. They will not represent Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, Aquaman, etc. the way they deserve to be represented on the silver screen. I think they should just scrap it. I think Zaslav's best strategy is to focus on animated stuff. Hey, do animated theatrical releases. It worked for Spider-Man. Why hasn't DC done it? I would go see that just out of curiosity, even if it turned out to be woke garbage. Just because I like the medium that much. I like animation, I like DC. I'd get people together to go see it. But I don't see that in DC's future. They've got to at least be considering it after Across from the Spider-Verse. They got to be. If James Gunn is not bringing somebody on board to do something like that, then they're foolish. They're absolutely foolish. Or they might think, no, we're doing fine with our direct-to-video animators, and so be it. But having a theatrical release for one of those would be amazing. I think it would do gangbusters, to be honest with you. But what do I know? I've just been a fan of DC all my life, pretty much. I don't know. I think it's a stronger brand than Marvel. I think they're better heroes, and I think if you showcase who these heroes are, people will see that. Not that Marvel heroes are bad, but I think DC is definitely stronger. But there's too much in the way right now. The live-action stuff is just plagued with bad decision making, bad casting, wokeness, and bad storylines, and stuff that just doesn't draw people who are fans. You got to focus on the fans of these things first, and then you can draw in the larger audiences. Hollywood just does not understand this with its franchises. They want to appeal to as many people as possible, and in the attempt to do that, they don't actually appeal to as many people as possible. The original way the heroes are written appeals to as many people as possible. People just need to go out of their way to read the comics, to watch the television shows. Oh, but I don't want to put in the work. Nah. That's on them. That's not on the brand. The brand has already existed. The brand is already super strong. You want to talk about brand strength? Look at what Barbie is doing by virtue of the brand. Most people don't think it's a good movie that I've talked to, but it's still doing gangbusters. I think it started to see some slowdown, but I mean, it's defying the typical get woke, go broke rule in many ways, but not because it's not woke, but because it's Barbie. I think they're going to see a drop-off with any sequels they do because the storytelling just wasn't as good. But regardless, if you've got a core strength brand, represent that brand honestly and accurately. People know these brands. If they don't know these brands, they're not going to be so lost that they can't pay attention. There's resources out there now more than ever to where people can do their research and understand what these brands are and why they mean so much to people. That's how you introduce somebody to something. You don't just try to strip away all of the elements that made those things what they are and then try to reintroduce them as something they're not. That's why the New 52 line of comics failed, even though I liked it, because that's when I got into comics. I know a lot of people are going to go, oh, how could you like the New 52? The New 52 was horrific. I thought it was some pretty good storylines. And my friend who got me largely into comics thought they were pretty good too. He collected a lot of them. I don't think they were as horrifically bad as somebody said, or as most people would say. But now Rebirth, that's a whole different story. I didn't pay attention to Rebirth because at that point I was like, okay, they're just, yeah, this isn't worth it. This isn't worth it at all. So, and they're just going to keep rebooting these heroes. That's DC's worst thing, and Marvel does it too. So, at the end of the day on the comic scene, I think the independents are going to vastly take them over, and they're going to be going to these people to have them write stories and do art. So, I don't know. I think DC needs to just commit to more animation and to strengthening their comic base, and then maybe doing Superman every once in a while, Batman once in a while, Green Lantern, Flash. Build up the Justice League. Don't just spit it out like they did with Zack Snyder. That was a horrible decision. You gotta build up to a Justice League movie because those characters require time and care to be put into them for the audience to actually really care about them. They need to go through the significant events of their storylines. So, anyways, let me know what you think about DC Comics and live action in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Super Koopa TV. Remember, Hollywood doesn't respect you. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.